Some people arrive in a town looking like they belong there. Senna was not one of them. She was sitting on the front steps of the Clearfield boarding house on a Tuesday afternoon in October, with a cloth bundle beside her and the expression of someone who has run out of options and is not yet ready to admit it. Her dark hair was coming loose from its tie. Her dress, linen, travel-worn, had seen better days and better months. Her skin was a pale olive green that caught the low autumn light and announced, before she opened her mouth, the fact that would shape every conversation she had in this town before any other fact about her was considered. She was Orc. She was alone, and she had come from the eastern settlements following her uncle, the last family she had in the world. He had written to her in January. "Come west," he said. "There is room here. There is a life worth building." She had packed everything she owned into the cloth bundle, sold the rest for less than it was worth, because the buyer knew she was leaving. And buyers always know when a seller has no leverage. And she had boarded a wagon going west with the particular, desperate optimism of a person who has exactly one option left and has decided to call it hope. Her uncle had died 2 weeks before she arrived. Fever, quick at the end. He had left nothing behind except an unfiled land claim and a small debt at the general store. The woman at the general store had told her this while looking at her green skin with the expression of someone doing mathematics they would rather not show their work on. The debt was $7. The claim was worthless. The uncle was in the ground on the hill east of town, in a grave Senna had not been present for, and would visit tomorrow, or the day after, when she could afford the walk without worrying about whether the energy it cost would leave her too tired to keep looking for work. She had nowhere to go back to. She had nothing to go back to. Her parents were dead. Her mother's house had been sold. The land her family had worked for 2 generations was in someone else's name now. The east was a closed door. The west was an empty building and a dead man's debt. So she sat on the boarding house steps in Clearfield, doing the arithmetic of a life that had run out of numbers. She had $4.30. The boarding house cost $2 a night. She could afford 2 nights, which gave her 2 days to find work. 2 days in a frontier town that had looked at her green skin 3 times already today and said no 3 times already today. The general store needed no one. The restaurant was fully staffed, and the owner had said it without meeting her eyes. The particular avoidance of a person who is saying no to the question being asked, and no to the question that wasn't asked but that hangs in the air between an orc woman and a human business owner, like smoke that neither of them will acknowledge. The boarding house itself needed a chambermaid, and the woman who ran it had considered Senna for a full 3 seconds before saying the position had been filled that morning, which was a lie that both of them recognized and neither of them commented on. The inn at the edge of town had been her last attempt. She walked in, asked about a room for the night, and the innkeeper, a broad man with clean hands and the comfortable certainty of someone who has never been turned away from anything, looked at her green face and said, $2 a night. Then, after a pause calibrated to communicate exactly what it was communicating, for Orcs, it's 3. She did not ask why. She knew why. The why was the same everywhere and had been the same her entire life. A surcharge on existence, a tax on the condition of being born in a body the world had decided was worth less while charging more. She left the inn and walked back to the boarding house steps and sat down and did the arithmetic. One more time, because arithmetic does not care about the color of your skin, and sometimes the honesty of numbers is the only comfort available. It was then that a boy of about 9 stopped directly in front of her. He had the direct gaze of a child who has not yet learned that staring is impolite, and the particular open-faced curiosity of someone who sees a thing and wants it explained. He was human, brown-haired with the kind of face that holds every thought it has ever had, right on the surface where anyone can read it. "Why are you sad?" he said. "Before we go any further, if you believe that sometimes a child's question is the one that changes everything, take a moment to subscribe to Orc Girl Tales, then leave a like and drop a comment. What happens next on these steps is the beginning of a story neither of them planned." And before she could answer, a man's voice said, "Rowan." She looked up. The man was tall, dark-haired, with gray at the temples, wearing a work coat over a linen shirt. with the sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the October cold. He had the look of someone who works outdoors and has stopped noticing it. He was holding a list and a package from the general store, and he gave the boy a look that had clearly worn a groove into both of them. The same look, probably repeated for 3 years running. "Rowan," he said again. "Quieter." "She looks sad, Papa," the boy said without moving. He said it as a fact, the way children state facts, without the adult decoration that turns observation into judgment or obligation. "People are allowed to be sad," the man said. "It's not our business." "But we could make it our business," Rowan said. The girl, younger, dark braid, 7 or so, was watching everything from beside her father's hip. She said nothing. She had the steady, absorbing attention of someone who takes in more than she gives back, a child who processes the world by watching it rather than asking it questions. Senna looked at the three of them, the man with the gray temples and the patient tiredness in his face, the boy with the direct gaze, the girl with the quiet eyes. "But in not that I had orange dara, banana, bandiases, pingram, waskai, painzo, hafanango, barrow and grocer, the guy Alasking, waved sage, God's puster." "I'm all right," she said, which was not true but was the most available answer in a world where orc women learn early that the truth is a luxury, and "I'm all right" is a wall that requires no maintenance. The man looked at her the way a rancher looks at weather, reading what is actually there, not what he would prefer to find. His eyes moved across the bundle, the worn dress, the boarding house steps, the particular quality of stillness that belongs to a person who has stopped moving because there is nowhere left to move to. "Theron Ashby," he said. He shifted the package to his left hand and extended his right. "This is Rowan. That's Willa." "Senna," she said, and shook his hand. His grip was calloused and warm and brief, the handshake of a man who means it, but does not hold on longer than the gesture requires. "You're not from Clearfield," he said. "Eastern settlements," she said. "I came to find my uncle." Something shifted in his face. Not pity, something quieter. The recognition of a man who knows what it is to have something not be where you expected it. "Did you find him?" he said. She looked at the street, the dust, the afternoon light going long and golden across the buildings. "He died before I arrived," she said. Rowan had stopped fidgeting. Willa had moved slightly closer to her father's side, the instinctive motion of a child who senses that something important is happening and wants to be near the person she trusts most while it happens. "I'm sorry," Theron said, and he meant it. She could hear the weight of it, the difference between condolence spoken by someone who has also lost something real and condolence spoken by someone who has not. "Is there somewhere you're staying?" he said. She looked at the boarding house behind her, then back at him. "I'm working on that," she said. He nodded once, the way men nod when they have heard an answer and understood everything it is not saying. Then he gathered his children and walked away down the street, and Senna watched them go, the tall man and the boy and the quiet girl, and she thought nothing about it because she had run out of room in her mind for anything except the arithmetic. She spent the afternoon doing what she could. The laundry at the edge of town was a possibility. The woman who ran it, a Mrs. Hartley, said she might have work next week, not this week, and looked at Senna's hands with the assessment of someone measuring the difference between a woman who hasn't. Senna had worked. She had run her family's house since she was 14, after her mother died. Cooking, mending, accounts, the endless practical management of a life without anyone ever asking whether she wanted to be the one doing it. She was back in her room doing the arithmetic again. $4.30 minus $2 for tonight. $2.30 remaining. One more night, and then nothing, when there was a knock at the door. She opened it. Rowan Ashby was standing in the hallway holding a covered pot with both hands, gripping it with the serious concentration of a boy who has been trusted with something hot and is determined not to drop it. "Papa made stew," he said. "He said you probably hadn't eaten." Behind him, in the hallway, at a careful distance that made clear he had sent the boy ahead, rather than knock himself. Theron Ashby was looking at the wall with the studied attention of a man who is pretending to examine the grain of the wood while his 9-year-old son does the thing he could not quite bring himself to do. He didn't have to do that, Senna said. I know, Rowan said. He does things he doesn't have to do. He paused, then added, with the gravity of a 9-year-old who considers himself a reliable source of household intelligence. Willa says it's because Mama isn't here anymore, and he doesn't know what to do with the extra. Down the hallway, Theron Ashby closed his eyes briefly. Senna took the pot. It was warm in her hands. The smell of it, beef and root vegetables and something herbed and slow-cooked, rose through the lid and filled the doorway of the small room where she had been sitting alone with her numbers. And the smell was so ordinary and so kind that it nearly undid her. A 9-year-old should not have to carry that kind of clarity about his own father's grief. But Rowan did. He carried it the way children carried the truths they discover about their parents openly and without understanding how heavy they are, handing them to strangers at hotel doors like they were the most natural thing in the world. Senna ate alone in her room with the door closed and the pot balanced on her knee. Because the room had no table, and the stew was the best thing she had tasted in weeks, not because of how it was made, but because of why it had been brought. Someone had seen her. Someone had noticed the arithmetic in the worn dress and the empty look, and had responded not with charity but with food, which is different because charity is a transaction, and food is a language, and the language said, "You are here, and that is enough reason to feed you." She washed the pot in the basin and left it outside her door, and in the morning, it was gone. She stayed a second night and a third, because Mrs. Hartley sent word that she could start at the laundry on Thursday, which meant Senna needed to be in Clearfield on Thursday, which required money she did not quite have. The experimental cry of Dodd. Finally, this mental turned to have a body in the roof of tablet. Bring the crow to the right, die on further frowsing. The toads per day after his breath were big enough to carry out. The problem resolved itself on Wednesday morning when she came downstairs and was told by the boarding house clerk that 3 more nights had been paid for. No name was given. None was needed. She found Theron at the feed store. He was loading sacks onto a wagon and did not stop working when she approached. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know, he said without looking up. I'll pay you back. You don't have to. I will anyway. He stopped loading. He straightened and looked at her directly, not measuring her this time, just looking. A quiet, steady look that held no agenda and no expectation. All right, he said. You will. It was not a dismissal. It was the acknowledgement of a man who understood that accepting help and accepting charity were different things, and who respected the difference without making a point of it. Senna worked at the laundry Thursday through Saturday. It was hard and hot, and she was good at it, the way she was good at everything she had been doing since she was 14, with the quiet, thorough competence of a woman who has spent a decade holding things together and has never once been thanked for the holding. Mrs. Hartley told her Saturday she could come back next week. Not a solution, but a direction. The first direction she had been given since the wagon dropped her in Clearfield 5 days ago. Theron came by the laundry on Saturday afternoon with Rowan and Willa. He said he was passing by. The laundry was not on the way to anywhere he had mentioned going. Rowan told her, while his father spoke with Mrs. Hartley about a delivery, that Willa had asked at breakfast whether the Orc lady from the boarding house was going to stay. What did your father say? Senna asked. Rowan thought about it with the careful attention of a boy who takes the responsibility of accurate reporting very seriously. He said he didn't know, Rowan said, but he said it like he was hoping you would. He went back to watching the street with the serenity of a child who has delivered his message and considers his work done. Senna looked at the boy, this 9-year-old messenger who delivered his father's hopes with the casual precision of a postal carrier who does not read the mail but understands its importance. She wanted to ask what "hoping you would" looked like on a man's face when he said it. But she did not ask, because Rowan had already told her everything she needed to know, and the rest was for Theron to say himself, if and when he was ready. She worked the following week at the laundry press and fold, the repetitive, meditative work of a woman whose hands have always been busy and whose mind, for the first time in months, had something to think about besides arithmetic. She thought about the stew, about the boarding house nights paid without a name attached, about a boy who delivered truth at hotel doors, and a girl who asked about braids because her father practiced on the horse's mane and the braids fell out, about a man who had shown her a dead garden like it was the most important thing on his property, which it was, because it was not a garden at all. It was his heart laid out in soil and stone, and he had shown it to her. She thought about the inn where the price doubled for Orcs, about the general store where the answer was no before the question was asked, about the laundry where Mrs. Hartley had looked at her hands and not her skin, and had hired her for what she could do rather than what she looked like, and how that single act of practical fairness had been enough to make Senna's eyes sting with a gratitude she would never express aloud, because expressing it would acknowledge how rare it was. And acknowledging how rare it was would mean admitting how much of her life had been spent on the other side of fairness, where the price was always higher and the welcome was always conditional, and the arithmetic always came out wrong. She thought about Theron's words, "My children need a mother." 5 words that were an offer and a confession and a hope and a risk, all wrapped in the same sentence, delivered on a porch in the evening light by a man who had turned around at the end of a street because he remembered what it felt like to almost not speak to the person who became everything. She pressed another shirt. She folded it. She put it on the stack, and she kept thinking. The boarding house room was small and cold and smelled of old wood and lamp oil. The ceiling had a water stain in the shape of something Senna could not identify. The bed was narrow, and the mattress was thin, and the blanket was the kind of blanket that frontier boarding houses provide, which is to say it was technically a blanket in the way that a locked door is technically security. She lay awake in the narrow bed and listened to the town settle into its nighttime quiet. Wagons going home, dogs barking at distances that made them sound like questions asked and never answered. The particular creak of an old building adjusting to the cold wood, contracting nails shifting, the slow, constant negotiation between a structure and the weather that surrounds it. She thought about the pot of stew she had eaten that evening, and the boy who brought it, and the man in the hallway who had sent his son ahead because knocking on the door of a woman he barely knew felt like too much, and sending nothing felt like too little. And the solution he had arrived at, the 9-year-old ambassador with the covered dish and the devastating clarity about his father's grief, was the most perfectly calibrated act of kindness she had experienced in years. He doesn't know what to do with the extra love, the extra attention, the extra caring that had been aimed at a woman who was no longer there to receive it, spilling over the edges of a man's heart and flowing without direction, without destination, into the world around him, landing on a stranger sitting on boarding house steps, landing in a pot of stew carried by a boy who understood at 9 that love that has nowhere to go does not disappear, it redirects. Senna closed her eyes in the narrow bed and thought about redirection, and about a man who stood at the end of a street and turned around, and about a girl who had not yet asked her about braids but would, soon, in the particular way that children ask for the things they need most, which is to say, quietly, carefully, and only when they are certain the answer will be yes. She slept. She dreamed of nothing she could remember, and in the morning, the pot was gone from outside her door, collected in the dark by a man who had walked 3 miles into town and 3 miles back in the cold because his son had told him the lady from Tennessee probably had not eaten. Willis spoke to her for the first time, on a Sunday. Theron had brought the children to church. Senna had gone alone and found them, 2 rows ahead, Rowan fidgeting, Willis still, Theron with the particular posture of a man who comes to church because his wife used to and stopping would feel like giving up something else she left behind. Afterward, Theron introduced her to the Reverend and several townspeople with the easy directness of a man who had decided something without announcing it. They walked back along the main street, all 4 of them, in the way that happens when nobody has planned it and everyone has accepted it. Rowan was explaining something about horses with the encyclopedic enthusiasm of a 9-year-old who considers himself the territory's foremost authority on equine behavior. Theron was listening with the practiced patience of a man who has heard this lecture before and will hear it again and does not mind. Willa walked beside Senna. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said without preamble, "Do you know how to braid hair?" "Yes," Senna said. "Papa tries," Willa said. "He practices on the horse's mane. The horse doesn't mind, but the braids fall out." Senna looked down at the girl. 7 years old, dark braid, slightly uneven, the work of a man's hands doing something they had not been designed for, and doing it anyway, every morning, because the person who used to do it was gone. "Would you like me to braid yours?" Senna asked. Willa looked up at her with dark, serious eyes. She considered the offer with the gravity she brought to most things, the particular deliberation of a child who does not say yes easily and who means it completely when she does. "Tomorrow," she said, "before school." She went back to walking. Behind them, Theron had stopped mid-sentence. Rowan was still talking about horses. The afternoon light caught the uneven braid in Willa's hair, and Senna understood with a clarity that required no explanation, that she had just been given something, not asked for something, given something. The trust of a 7-year-old girl who had been watching her for days and had finally decided, through whatever private deliberation children conduct with themselves, that the orc woman from the boarding house was safe enough to touch her hair. If you feel what just happened on that street, subscribe to Orc Girl Tales right now and leave a like and a comment. What comes next is the part where a dead garden tells the truth a living man cannot say. She braided Willa's hair the next morning at the boarding house, the girl sitting on the bed with her back very straight and her hands folded in her lap, and the braid was tight and even and stayed in all day. And when Willa came home from school, she told her father that Miss Senna's braids were better than the horses, which was the highest compliment in her vocabulary. Theron brought Senna to the ranch on a Wednesday. He said it was because Rowan had been insisting, which was true, but not the whole truth. The way most of the things Theron said were true but carried additional weight in the spaces between the words. The ranch was 3 miles outside Clearfield, at the base of a long ridge sheltered from the worst of the wind. A stone house, a good barn, a corral where 3 horses stood in the afternoon light. The kind of place that tells you, at a glance, that the person who built it understood permanence and cared about it. Rowan showed her the horses, naming each one with the solemn formality of a boy introducing colleagues. The black one was Thunder, who was not as fast as his name suggested. The bay was Clover, who was gentle and knew it and used it to get extra feed. The roan was Captain, who answered to nobody and was respected for it. Senna listened to all of this with the full attention of a woman who understood that a 9-year-old boy explaining horses for 40 minutes is not wasting your time. He is showing you his whole world, and the appropriate response is to stand in it with him and look at what he is looking at and treat it as though it matters, because to him, it does. Willa showed her the house, the kitchen, which was clean and organized in the particular way of a man who has learned to keep a kitchen running by following the system his wife established, and never changing any of it, because changing it would mean admitting she was not coming back. The front room, where a photograph on the mantelpiece showed a woman with dark hair and a smile that looked like it could fill a room. Clara. Senna looked at the photograph and understood, without anyone telling her, that the woman in the frame was the absence the whole house was built around. Then Theron showed her the garden. It was behind the kitchen, a rectangular patch of ground enclosed by a low stone wall that Clara had laid herself. The beds were overgrown, the soil compacted, the stakes fallen and not replaced. Nothing was growing. Nothing had been growing for 2 years. It was, in every practical sense, a dead garden, a space that had once been tended and loved, and was now held in the particular suspension of a place whose purpose has been lost, along with the person who gave it. 1. Theron stood at the edge of it and looked at the dead beds with an expression that Senna recognized because she had worn it herself, standing in front of her mother's orchard, after the bank took the land. The expression of a person looking at something that used to be alive and trying to remember what it felt like when it was. "Clara planted the apple tree the first year," he said. nodding toward a young tree at the far corner of the garden, bare-branched in the October cold, but alive, its roots deep enough to have survived 2 years of neglect. First thing she did when we got here, before the furniture was unpacked, before the curtains went up, she put a tree in the ground. He paused. The garden was her heart. She grew everything in it: herbs, vegetables, flowers she ordered from a catalog back east. She said a house without a garden was just a building, and she didn't come west to live in a building. He looked at the dead beds. I haven't been able to touch it. Not because I don't know how, because touching it means admitting she's not coming back to do it herself. Senna stood beside him and looked at the garden. She understood with a certainty that bypassed words entirely that he had not brought her here to show her a piece of land. He had brought her here to show her his grief. The dead garden was not a gardening problem. It was the physical manifestation of a man's heart laid out in soil and stone, and showing it to her was the most honest thing he had done since they met. She should be known about, he said quietly, by the children, by anyone who comes into this house. I don't want her to be a silence. Then we make sure she isn't, Senna said. We tell the stories, we keep the tree. Something settled in him that had not been settled in 2 years. A tension in his shoulders that she had not noticed because it had always been there, the permanent clench of a man holding everything by himself, eased by a degree. Not all the way, but enough for her to see it move. The weeks that followed were a slow, careful conversation, conducted in gestures rather than words. Theron brought the children to see Senna at the boarding house on Saturday afternoons. She braided Willa's hair. She listened to Rowan explain horses. She sat with Theron on the boarding house porch while the children played, and they talked about the things people talk about when they are learning each other, without admitting that learning each other is what they are doing. She told him about the Eastern settlements, about her parents, about the uncle who had promised a new beginning and died before delivering it, about the arithmetic of $4.30 and $2 nights and the particular exhausting mathematics of a life where every decision is a subtraction. He told her about Clara, not the grief of Clara which he had shown her in the garden, the life of Clara, her laugh which Rowan had inherited, her stillness which Willa had inherited, the way she read books in the evening with her hair coming loose from its pins, the same way it always did by evening, and the way she looked up and met his eyes and went back to her book, and the whole exchange took less than a second and contained an entire conversation. He told her about the 2 years since, the mornings that started with reaching for someone who was not there, the evenings that ended with a silence that had its own sound, the children growing into people he was trying to raise alone, with the half-understood instructions of a man who had always had a partner and was now working without the manual. One evening, sitting on the boarding house porch, while the children chased fireflies in the fading light, Senna said the thing she had been carrying since she arrived. I have no family left, she said. She said it quietly, the way a person says something they have been holding in their chest for so long that it has become part of the architecture. A load-bearing wall that cannot be removed without the whole structure shifting. Not one person. I'm the last of everyone I've ever belonged to. Theron looked at her. He looked at his children in the yard, Rowan running, Willa watching, both of them orbiting the boarding house porch where the Orc woman sat with the gravitational certainty of children who have decided where they want to be. Funny, he said. His voice was quiet and steady and held a weight that had nothing to do with humor. My children need a mother. The words sat between them on the porch in the evening air, and neither of them moved to make them smaller or larger or different from what they were. They were an offer, not a proposal, not a declaration, an offer made by a man who understood that the distance between I have no family and my children need a mother was a distance that could only be crossed by the person standing on the other side, and only if she chose to cross it. Senna looked at the fireflies. She looked at the children. She looked at the man beside her, with his gray temples and his patient hands, and his dead garden, and his boy who brought stew to strangers because his mother was gone, and his father did not know what to do with the extra. She did not say yes, not yet, but she did not say no, and the space she left between them was not empty. It was the space where a decision was being made, slowly and carefully, by a woman who had been alone long enough to know that wanting something did not make it safe, and that safe and right were not always the same word. The hard question, the one she carried through the following week, while she worked at the laundry and braided Willa's hair and listened to Rowan explain the difference between a canter and a gallop, was whether she was saying yes to Theron or yes to not being alone anymore. Whether there was a difference, whether it mattered. She had been alone a long time, not always physically, alone in the way of someone who is always holding things together for someone else, and is never the person being held. Since she was 14, since her mother died, she had been the one managing, the one cooking, the one mending, the one doing the accounts and keeping the house and making sure everything held together, while nobody asked whether she wanted to be the one doing the holding. She was afraid that wanting would make her accept something that was merely adequate and tell herself it was enough. She had seen women do that. She did not want to be one of them. On Thursday, she went to the ranch to return a book Rowan had lent her about horses. Willa was on the porch attempting to mend a piece of cloth with concentration that greatly exceeded her skill. She looked up. "Are you going to stay?" Willa said. "I'm thinking about it," Senna said. "Rowan thinks you will," Willa said. "He says Papa looks different when you're here." Different how? Willa considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. "Less like he's holding everything by himself," she said. She went back to her mending. Senna sat on the porch step and looked at the mountains and understood, with the quiet certainty that arrives when a child says the true thing without knowing it, that the question she had been carrying all week was the wrong one. The right question was simpler. Did she want to hold things together with someone instead of alone? The answer had been yes. For a long time, she had just been afraid to say it out loud because saying it out loud made it real, and real things could be lost. She had already lost everything real in her life. Parents, home, land, the uncle who was supposed to be the beginning of something new. Losing one more real thing might be the one that finished her. But sitting on that porch, looking at the mountains, listening to Willa's needle moving through cloth with more determination than accuracy, she understood something that changed the equation. The risk of losing was real, but the cost of never reaching was higher. And she had spent enough of her life on the arithmetic of safety to know that safe is not the same as right, and that the difference between them is the difference between surviving and living, which is considerable. She found Theron at the north fence on Friday morning. She had not planned to go looking for him. She had planned to go to the laundry, but she had walked 3 blocks and stopped and turned around because she had the answer, and holding it one more day felt like a waste of time. Neither of them needed to waste. He saw her coming across the field and stopped working and waited with the patience of a man who has decided not to assume anything. "I've been thinking about what you said," she said. "I know," he said. "I want to say yes, but I need to say something first." He waited. The fence post was between them. The morning light was on the mountains. Somewhere behind the house, Rowan was talking to the horses. "I'm not doing this because I have nowhere else to go," she said. "I have the laundry. Mrs. Hartley offered me steady work. I had another offer this week from a man the town considers a reasonable choice." She looked at him directly, green face, amber brown eyes, the full, unflinching attention of a woman who needs the person she is talking to understand the difference between desperation and decision. "I'm saying yes because of Rowan explaining the horses for 40 minutes. And because Willa asked me to braid her hair, and because you showed me a dead kitchen garden like it was the most important thing on the property." She paused. "I'm saying yes because of you, not because of the alternative." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, "I need to tell you something." She waited. "When I saw you on those boarding house steps," he said, "Rowan asked why you were sad, and I told him it wasn't our business. I walked away believing that. I got to the end of the street and stopped, because I kept thinking about the day I met Clara and how I almost didn't say anything, and how different everything would have been." He looked at the fence post. "I turned around. I came back, and Rowan had already started talking to you." The corner of his mouth moved. "He's been trying to give me a second chance ever since." Senna looked at this man, his fence post, his gray temples, his boy who brought stew to strangers at hotel doors, his girl who asked about braids because her father practiced on the horse's mane, and the horse didn't mind, but the braids fell out. "Yes," she said, simply, completely. "Yes." She stood at the fence and looked at the man in the mountains behind him, and the fear was still there, the fear of reaching for something real and having it taken, the way everything real in her life had been taken. But standing beside the fear, taking up equal space, was something she had not felt since before her mother died and her father's debts swallowed the house and the orchard, and the only life she had ever known. It was the feeling of ground beneath her feet, not the ground of a boarding house she could not afford, or a laundry where she was tolerated, or a town that charged her $3 for a $2 room. Real ground, the kind you plant things in, the kind that holds. Theron held out his hand across the fence post, the same gesture he had made on the boarding house steps, the same calloused, warm, steady grip. She took it, and the fence post between them was the last barrier, and they both understood that it was not a barrier at all. It was a threshold. "When?" she said. "December," he said. "If that gives you enough time." Enough time for what? To be sure. She looked at him, at his gray temples, at the patience that was not passivity, but certainty, at the quiet, enormous love that he carried for 2 children and a dead wife, and a garden he could not touch, and a life he was holding together with hands that shook sometimes when he thought nobody was looking. "I've been sure since the stew," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, the place where a smile lives when a man has been too careful for too long and is only just learning to let it out again. "Rowan's going to be insufferable," he said. "He earned it," she said. They stood on either side of the fence post with their hands joined across the top of it, and the morning light was on the mountains, and somewhere behind the house Rowan was telling the horses that Miss Senna was going to stay, which he had apparently decided several weeks before anyone else, and considered the delay in everyone else catching up to be a personal inconvenience. They married in December in the Clearfield church. Rowan was the most pleased person in attendance and made no effort whatsoever to conceal it. He told 3 separate people before the ceremony that he had been the one who started the conversation, which was true, and that his father had tried to walk away, which was also true, and that the stew had been his idea, which was not quite true, but which nobody corrected because the boy's pride in the outcome was too genuine and too large to diminish with details. Willow wore a ribbon that Senna had put in her braid that morning, a small piece of blue fabric tied at the end that Senna had bought with her first full week's wages from the laundry. Willa stood very straight at the altar with the gravity of someone participating in something she had been working toward since the first Sunday, when she asked the Orc woman from the boarding house whether she knew how to braid hair. Theron stood at the altar and watched Senna walk toward him, and thought about a Tuesday afternoon, and a woman on boarding house steps, and a boy who asked the wrong question at exactly the right moment. He thought about the end of the street, where he had stopped and turned around, because the memory of almost not speaking to Clara had caught him by the throat and refused to let him walk one more step away from a woman who was clearly, visibly running out of numbers. The practical work began in January. There was the ranch to learn, fence lines and cattle patterns, and which pasture held through a dry summer and which did not. There were the children's rhythms to understand, the unspoken rules of a household that had developed its own grammar over 2 years without her, a language of habits and routines and small rituals that she entered carefully, the way a person enters a conversation that started before they arrived. Rowan taught her things about the horses, with the seriousness of someone conferring professional knowledge. Each lesson was delivered with the absolute confidence of a 9-year-old who believes that his expertise is indispensable and who is, in his own particular way, correct. Senna listened to every lesson completely, asked follow-up questions at appropriate intervals, and never once made the boy feel that his knowledge was anything less than essential. Willa taught her without saying so exactly where her mother had stood in the kitchen and what that meant. The spot by the window where Clara had done the washing up, looking out at the mountains. The hook by the door where her apron had hung. The chair at the table that was hers and that nobody had sat in since she died. Senna learned these coordinates the way a navigator learns a chart, understanding that the spaces left empty in a house are not empty at all. They are occupied by memory, and memory deserves the same respect as presence. She did not fill Clara's chair. She brought her own and set it beside it, and the two chairs at the table, one empty and one occupied, said more about the kind of woman Senna was than any speech could have communicated. She had not come to replace anyone. She had come to sit alongside the absence and keep it company while building something new beside it. The kitchen garden was her first project. She started in late October, turning the soil, pulling the overgrown weeds, clearing the beds that Clara had laid out and that 2 years of neglect had nearly erased. She worked on it every morning before dawn, her green hands in the dark earth, the cold air on her face, and the work felt like restoration rather than creation. The careful recovery of something that had been loved and lost and was being given the chance to grow again. She planted winter varieties first, root vegetables that could survive the frost, hardy herbs that her mother had grown in the eastern settlements, the same varieties she had known since childhood, carried in her memory the way other people carry photographs. She did not have seeds from her mother's garden. Those were gone with everything else. But she had the knowledge, which lived in her hands the way her mother had said it would. And knowledge, unlike land or houses or money, cannot be taken. Theron came out one evening and stood at the garden wall and watched her work in the last light. She was kneeling in the bed nearest the apple tree, pressing seeds into soil she had turned and amended, and prepared with the particular care of a woman who understands that a garden is a promise made to the future, and that the quality of the promise depends on the quality of the preparation. Clara planted the apple tree first thing, he said, before the furniture was unpacked. I know, Senna said. You told me. She should be known about, he said, by the children, by you, by everyone who lives in this house after us. Then we make sure she is, Senna said. We tell the stories, we keep the tree, we let her name be a thing the children carry without it being a weight. Something settled in him. She could see it happen. The particular releasing of a tension that had been held so long it had become structural, a load-bearing wall of grief that he had been holding up for 2 years, and that was, in this moment, being shared for the first time. Not removed, shared. The wall was still there, but it was no longer his alone. The winter passed. Senna learned the ranch the way she learned everything, with the thorough, quiet competence of a woman who has been mastering new situations since she was 14, and who does not require praise or instruction to do it well. She learned which gate stuck in cold weather and which horse needed the most attention and which corner of the barn leaked when the rain came from the east. She learned the particular creak of the floorboard outside Rowan's room that meant he was up past bedtime, and the particular silence from Willa's room that meant she was reading by candlelight, and the particular quality of Theron's footsteps on the porch at dawn that told her whether the day ahead would be easy or hard. She cooked Orc recipes her mother had taught her, the deep herbed broths and slow-cooked stews that filled the kitchen with smells the house had never known. And Rowan ate everything with the undiscriminating enthusiasm of a 9-year-old who considers any food served to him a personal gift. And Willa ate carefully and thoughtfully and said, after the first meal, this tastes like somewhere else. Somewhere I haven't been. Which was, Senna thought, the most precise description of Orc cooking she had ever heard from a 7-year-old. She braided Willa's hair every morning. The girl sat on the bed in the room that had been Clara's sewing room and was now Senna's quiet space. And Senna worked the dark hair into patterns that grew more elaborate as the weeks passed, because Willa had opinions about braids, and Senna had the skill to execute them. And the collaboration produced results that the girl wore to school, with the particular pride of someone whose hair has been done by a professional. Theron, who had spent 2 years practicing on the horse's mane with results that satisfied neither the horse nor the daughter, watched Senna braid Willa's hair one morning from the hallway doorway and said nothing. But the relief on his face was visible from across the house. In May, the apple tree bloomed. Senna saw it first, coming out of the kitchen in the early morning, the first light of the day catching the blossoms in a way that made them glow white and pink against the dark branches, delicate and improbable, and stubbornly alive. The tree that Clara had planted the first year, the tree that had survived 2 years of a dead garden and a grieving husband, and the particular testing loneliness of a living thing growing in a place where everything else had stopped. Willa stood under the tree and looked up at the flowers with the expression of a child seeing something she has been told about for the first time. "Mama planted that," Rowan told her, standing beside her with his hands in his pockets, and the voice of a boy who carries his mother's memory as a fact rather than a wound. "First year, before the furniture." "I know," Willa said. "Senna told me." And there it was. The name passed from a dead woman through an Orc stranger to a 7-year-old girl who had been too young to remember the planting, but who now knew the story. Carried forward by the woman who had come to sit beside the absence and keep it company. The chain held. The tree bloomed. The story survived. On the porch that evening, all 4 of them sat in chairs that were full. Senna's chair beside Clara's empty one. Theron in his place. Rowan on the steps, talking about something, horses probably, with the inexhaustible enthusiasm of a boy who has found his subject and will not be separated from it. Willa beside Senna, her braid still perfect at the end of the day, reading a book with the focused attention of a child who processes the world by absorbing it rather than interrogating it. The Colorado evening held them all. The mountains did what they always did, which was to stand there enormous and indifferent and beautiful, the way mountains do everywhere and always, giving the people who live beneath them the particular comfort of knowing that some things are permanent even when everything else is not. Theron looked at his children, then at Senna. Her hair was coming loose from its tie, the way it always did by evening, and she was reading her book in the chair beside him, entirely at home. Green skin in the golden light, dark eyes on the page, the particular comfortable stillness of a person who has arrived somewhere and does not need to leave. He did not say anything. He did not need to. She looked up, met his eyes, and went back to her book. The exchange lasted less than a second and contained an entire conversation. For the first time in 2 years, the holding felt like enough. Senna arrived in Clearfield with a cloth bundle, $4.30, and no one left in the world who belonged to her. She sat on boarding house steps doing the arithmetic of a life that had run out of numbers, and a 9-year-old boy stopped in front of her and asked why she was sad. Adults learn over time to walk past people on steps. We learn to make it not our business. We learn the 100 small ways of not getting involved, the careful, practiced art of looking without seeing, of hearing without acting, of letting the arithmetic of someone else's life remain someone else's problem. Rowan had not learned any of that yet. He stopped. He asked, and his father, who had spent 2 years holding everything together alone, turned around at the end of the street and came back. There is something to be said about Senna, too. About the moment she stood at the laundry press on a Tuesday afternoon and understood that safe and right were not always the same word. That was a hard thing to learn. Most people never learn it, or learn it too late. She learned it at 24 in a frontier town where she had nothing, and she made the harder choice. The choice that risked something, the choice that could be lost. That took something. The right things usually do. Don't walk past the person on the steps. Ask the question, turn around at the end of the street. And if a 9-year-old boy with a pot of stew and more truth than he knows what to do with shows up at your door and tells you his father doesn't know what to do with the extra love since his mother died, take the stew, eat it, and stay. If this story has stayed with you, subscribe to ORC GIRL Tales so you don't miss the one still coming. Leave a like and tell me in the comments which moment. Why are you sad? We could make it our business. He doesn't know what to do with the extra. The braid that stayed in all day. Papa practices on the horse's mane. The dead garden. I have no family left. Funny, my children need a mother. I'm saying yes because of you, not because of the alternative. He's been trying to give me a second chance ever since. The apple tree blooming, or the porch, the 4 chairs, and the holding that finally felt like enough. Drop your answer below. Because somewhere tonight, someone is sitting on steps doing the arithmetic of a life that has run out of numbers. And somewhere else, a boy is about to stop and ask the question that changes everything. Let him ask, and when he does, don't walk past. Turn around. Come back. The kitchen garden grew. It grew the way Senna grew into the Ashby Ranch, slowly and with intention, each plant placed where it would do the most good, each row tended with the particular care of a woman who understood that growing things is not about forcing life out of the ground, but about creating the conditions where life chooses to emerge on its own. By the second spring, the garden was producing more than the household could eat. Senna began trading the surplus at the general store, the same store that had told her, "We're not hiring," on her first day in Clearfield. The woman behind the counter accepted the herbs and vegetables without commentary because the quality was undeniable. And commerce as always files down the sharper edges of prejudice when the product is good enough to make the filing worthwhile. Mrs. Hartley at the laundry asked her one Saturday whether she would be willing to teach a class on herbal remedies at the church hall. "The women in town want to learn," Mrs. Hartley said. "They've seen what grows in your garden, and they want to know how you do it." Senna agreed, and the first class had 14 women, most of them human, most of them sitting slightly forward in their chairs, with the particular attention of people who were learning something they did not expect to learn from someone they did not expect to learn it from. She taught them the way her mother had taught her, patiently, practically, with her green hands in the soil and her quiet voice naming each plant by its Orc name and its common name, because both names were true and neither was more true than the other. Several women came back the following week. By the third class, the number had grown to 20, and the church hall smelled of dried herbs and fresh soil, and the particular indefinable scent of a community being slowly, carefully changed by a woman who had arrived with $4.30 and a cloth bundle and absolutely no intention of changing anything except the direction of her own life. Rowan, who was 10 by then, attended every class from the back row, not because he was interested in herbs, but because he considered himself Senna's official assistant and took the role seriously enough to bring his own notebook, in which he recorded her instructions with the meticulous inaccuracy of a 10-year-old boy who was trying very hard and getting most of the spelling wrong, but all of the enthusiasm right. Willa, who was 8, sat beside Senna at the teaching table and demonstrated the braiding technique for lavender bundles that Senna had taught her, with the quiet competence of a girl who had found her skill and was not interested in being modest about it. Theron came to the last class of the season. He stood in the doorway of the church hall and watched his wife teach a room full of women how to grow things, and the expression on his face was the same expression he had worn in the garden on the day he showed her the dead beds and the apple tree and the grief he had been carrying for 2 years. It was not grief anymore. It was not the absence of grief either, because grief does not leave, it moves. It shifts from the center of a room to a corner of it, and the corner is still there, and the grief is still in it. But the rest of the room is now available for living, and the living fills it the way light fills a room when someone opens the curtains. Clara's photograph stayed on the mantelpiece. The apple tree stayed in the garden. The empty chair stayed at the table. None of these things were removed or hidden or replaced, because Senna understood, and Theron understood, and eventually the children understood, that a family is not built by erasing the past, but by setting new chairs beside the ones that are already there, and letting the table hold all of it. The grief and the growth, the missing and the found, the woman who planted the tree and the woman who tended the garden around it. Both of them present, both of them real, both of them part of the story that the house would tell for as long as it stood.